Imagine a world, a vast empire, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, ruled for 7 centuries by a single, unbroken bloodline. A dynasty that forged a nation from scattered tribes, defended it from invaders, and built an identity that would define it for millennia. Now, imagine that line snaps, vanishes. Overnight, the very concept of legitimate rule, of God-given authority, evaporates into thin air. A chasm opens, not just in the succession, but in the very soul of the nation. This is not just a royal crisis, it is an existential void. A land where no one knows who sits on the throne, or if there even is a legitimate throne. This, my friends, is how a kingdom descends into hell. This is how Russia plunged into the time of troubles, a period of unprecedented chaos and national suffering. Welcome to Boring History, where even the most tumultuous epochs become fascinating tales. Today, we delve into one of Russia's darkest, most chaotic chapters, the time of troubles, roughly 1598 to 1613. For over 700 years, the Rurikid dynasty was the bedrock of Russian statehood. From the semi-mythical Rurik in the 9th century to the Grand Princes of Moscow, they steadily consolidated power, pushing back invaders, slowly shaping the entity we know as Russia. Their reign culminated in Ivan IV, a figure so monumental, so paradoxical, he'd be etched into the national psyche as the Terrible. Ivan IV, born in 1530, ascended to the grand princely throne at just 3. His early life, a brutal education and court intrigue, left him with deep paranoia. He was a man of towering intellect, keen theologian, and brilliant strategist. It was Ivan who, in 1547, formally adopted the title of Tsar, asserting Russia's imperial ambitions and divine right to rule, positioning Moscow as the Third Rome. He conquered the Tatar Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, expanded Russia's borders, and introduced critical legal and administrative reforms. He seemed destined to be remembered as one of Russia's greatest unifiers, a titan who reshaped its destiny and left an indelible mark. But there was another Ivan, a darker, more capricious side. The man who, in his later years, would unleash an era of unbridled terror, the Oprichnina. In 1565, Ivan dramatically abdicated, only to return on his own terms, absolute power to punish traitors. He divided Russia, creating the Oprichnina, his personal domain, governed by loyal, black-clad Oprichniki. These were instruments of his paranoia, a private army loyal only to him, riding on black horses, carrying brooms and dogheads to symbolize their mission, to sweep out treason and gnaw at its enemies. The Oprichnina was a systematic campaign of terror against the boyars, Russia's ancient nobility, whom Ivan suspected of deep-seated disloyalty. Thousands were executed, tortured, or dispossessed, often on flimsy pretexts. Whole towns, like Novgorod, were brutalized. This terror broke the power of old aristocratic families, centralizing authority entirely in the Tsar's hands, but at horrific cost. It decimated the landowning class, emptied the treasury, and plunged the country into economic and social ruin. Russia was left weaker, poorer, deeply traumatized, its social fabric irrevocably torn. In a fit of rage, he even accidentally struck and mortally wounded his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, 1581, an act he deeply regretted, leaving him with no capable successor. When Ivan IV finally died in 1584, reportedly while playing chess, he left behind a vast empire, but one inwardly shattered, poisoned by fear, and teetering on the precipice of crisis. He had, in essence, sown the seeds of his dynasty's destruction. The heir to this poisoned chalice was Fyodor Ivanovich, Ivan's third and only surviving son from his first marriage. Fyodor, already in his late 20s when he became Tsar Feodor I, was a man utterly unlike his father. Pious, gentle, and intellectually frail, he was more interested in ringing church bells and spiritual contemplation than in affairs of state. Contemporaries described him as simple-minded, a Tsar by divine appointment but certainly not by temperament or ability. He was in effect a puppet ruler, a pious figurehead utterly unfit for the ruthless politics of the Russian court. The real power behind the throne belonged to a small council of regents, dominated by Fyodor's brother-in-law, the ambitious, shrewd, and immensely capable Boris Godunov. Godunov was a rising star from a prominent boyar family, elevated by Ivan IV. He quickly consolidated his influence, overseeing a period of relative stability, foreign policy successes, and a flourishing of Russian culture and architecture, including the completion of the Smolensk fortress and the establishment of the Moscow Patriarchate. Fyodor, meekly signing documents and attending endless church services, effectively allowed Godunov to govern the vast, complex realm. For a while, it seemed Russia might find a quiet equilibrium after Ivan's madness, guided by Godunov's steady hand. Yet a looming shadow persisted, the succession. Fyodor and his wife, Irina Godunova, were childless. The only other direct Rurikid heir was Dmitry Ivanovich, Ivan the Terrible's youngest son. Dmitry, a young boy, was living in internal exile in Uglich. Then, in May 1591, tragedy struck. The official report stated Dmitry, while playing with a knife during an epileptic seizure, accidentally fell on it and died. A local investigation, led by Vasily Shuyatsky, corroborated the story. But the circumstances were murky. His mother, Maria Nagaya, immediately cried foul, accusing Godunov of murder. Rumors swirled. Godunov, eager to secure his own family's assent, had orchestrated the boy's assassination. While no definitive proof emerged, the timing was certainly convenient for Boris. The official cause was accepted, but the seed of doubt, of regicide and usurpation, was irrevocably planted deep in the national consciousness. A pretender, a false Dmitry, would later capitalize on this uncertainty, igniting the flames of chaos. On January 7, 1598, Tsar Feodor I died childless. With him, the 700-year-old Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Russia since its inception, finally extinguished. The shock to Russia's political and spiritual landscape was deep. For centuries, the Tsar was God's chosen representative, the divine anchor. Now, that anchor was gone. The only obvious candidate was Boris Godunov, Fyodor's brother-in-law and de facto ruler for the past decade. But Boris was not of royal blood. His ascent required an election, a Zemsky Sobor, or Assembly of the Land. After orchestrated public demonstrations and a show of reluctance, the Zemsky Sobor formally elected Boris Godunov as Tsar in 1598. It was an unprecedented moment. Boris, a man of exceptional intellect and ambition, embarked on his reign with a vision for modernizing Russia. He fostered trade, invited foreign scholars, sent young Russians abroad for education, and invested in development. His early years were marked by prosperity and relative stability. He was in many ways an enlightened ruler, striving with genuine effort to lift Russia out of its isolated medieval past. But his reign was built on a profoundly fragile foundation, lingering suspicions around Dmitry's death and the novelty of his non-Rurikid claim. This fragile foundation would soon crack under the weight of an unimaginable natural disaster. Beginning in 1591, Russia was struck by a series of devastating crop failures. 3 consecutive summers of torrential rain and early frosts led to widespread famine. The Great Famine of 1591 to 1593 was one of the worst catastrophes in Russian history. Crops rotted, livestock perished, and grain prices skyrocketed. People resorted to eating weeds, tree bark, and even cannibalism. Moscow alone saw hundreds of thousands die. Estimates suggest perhaps a third of the Russian population perished. Boris Godunov responded with significant efforts, opening state granaries, distributing food, banning exports, and even temporarily loosening serfdom. But his efforts were overwhelmed. More importantly, in a deeply religious society, the famine was widely interpreted as divine punishment. Punishment for Godunov's supposed sins, for the murder of Dmitry, for the usurpation of the throne. The belief took root that God had withdrawn his blessing from an illegitimate Tsar. This catastrophic famine didn't just kill people, it shattered social order, ignited widespread brigandage by desperate peasants, and utterly undermined Tsar Boris's legitimacy. The very legitimacy he had struggled so hard to establish was now fatally compromised in the eyes of his people. And it was into this vortex of despair, divine wrath, and political instability that a new, dangerous figure emerged from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1503, reports began to circulate of a young man claiming to be Tsarev Dmitry Ivanovich, miraculously escaped from Uglich years earlier. This mysterious individual, whose true identity remains debated, presented himself as the rightful heir. Charismatic and ambitious, he found fertile ground for his audacious claims: an extinct Rurikid line, Dmitry's painful memory, and Godunov's shattered legitimacy. Polish magnates, keen to destabilize their eastern rival, offered him support. The stage was set. Russia, reeling from trauma and famine, was about to face its greatest challenge yet, an invasion led by a man claiming to be its rightful, miraculously returned Tsar. The time of troubles was no longer just a metaphor, it was about to become an existential battle for the very soul of the nation, a battle for survival.
And so, as the winter of 1604 gave way to a new spring, the figure claiming to be Tsarevich Dmitry Ivanovich began his audacious march into Russia. His army, a motley collection of Polish magnates' retinues, disgruntled Cossacks, and desperate Ukrainian mercenaries, was initially small, numbering perhaps a few thousand. But its true power lay not in its military might, but in its narrative. The miraculously returned heir, the divine answer to Russia's woes, the rightful Tsar. This narrative resonated deeply with a populace ravaged by famine, disillusioned with Boris Godunov, and primed for a messianic figure. Dmitry's initial forays were met with mixed results. He seized several border towns, leveraging the discontent of local populations who saw him as their liberator. However, he also faced staunch resistance, particularly from loyalist forces sent by Godunov. At the Battle of Dobrinichi in January 1605, Dmitry's forces suffered a significant defeat, forcing him to retreat. It seemed for a moment that Boris Godunov's military might, and perhaps his divine protection, would prevail. But this was merely a temporary reprieve. Godunov, though still the Tsar, was a man consumed by anxiety and suspicion. The very mention of Dmitry's name eroded his authority, poisoning the loyalty of his boyars and turning the hearts of his common people. His reputation as a usurper, once a murmur, now became a roar, amplified by the pretender's claims and the lingering trauma of the famine. Then, fate intervened with a cruel twist. On April 13, 1605, Boris Godunov, while dining with his family, collapsed and died, ostensibly of a stroke. The timing was catastrophic for the Godunov dynasty and providential for Dmitry. With the strong man gone, the fragile edifice of his rule crumbled with astonishing speed. Godunov's young son, Fyodor II, a brilliant but inexperienced 16-year-old, was proclaimed Tsar. But his reign was doomed from the start. Within weeks, Dmitry's letters, promising justice and vengeance against the Godunov usurpers, circulated through the army. Commander Pyotr Basmanov, a key general, defected with his troops. The gates of Moscow opened to the pretender, not through conquest but through betrayal and popular will. On June 1, 1605, just 7 weeks after Boris Godunov's death, Fyodor II and his mother were brutally murdered. Officially, they committed suicide by poison, a transparent lie that fooled no one. Their bodies were publicly displayed, stripped and desecrated, a chilling testament to the ruthlessness of the political transition. 3 weeks later, on June 20th, the self-proclaimed Dmitry Ivanovich made his triumphant entrance into Moscow, heralded by jubilant crowds who saw in him the embodiment of hope and the return of legitimate rule. He rode not as a conqueror, but as a long-lost son, a savior. His coronation in July 1605 was a lavish affair, cementing his claim, seemingly validated by the support of the patriarch and the boyars who, with varying degrees of sincerity, acknowledged him as the rightful heir. For a brief, hopeful period, it seemed the time of troubles might be over. False Dmitry I, as history would label him, was a man of energy and intelligence. He listened to petitions, displayed genuine concern for the common people, and implemented some popular reforms. He reduced taxes in some areas, promised to improve the lot of the peasantry, and even attempted to curtail the power of the kholopi, indentured servants, system. He was keenly interested in Western European culture and military practices, inviting foreign engineers and officers to Russia, much to the consternation of the traditionalist boyars. He envisioned a grand pan-European alliance against the Ottoman Empire, aiming to raise Russia's international standing. He held court with a lively informality that charmed some but appalled others, particularly the conservative Russian clergy and boyars, accustomed to the austere, almost divine presence of their tsars. However, Dmitry's brief reign, just under 11 months, was riddled with contradictions that ultimately sealed his fate. His Western inclinations were viewed with suspicion. He adopted Polish dress, spoke Latin, and was rumored to have abandoned Orthodox fasting practices. His choice of a Polish Catholic bride, Marina Minczek, daughter of a Polish magnate, was perhaps his greatest misstep. Her lavish arrival in Moscow, accompanied by a retinue of proud, arrogant Polish nobles and their armed retinues, was a public spectacle of foreign influence that deeply offended Russian sensibilities. These Polish guests openly scorned Russian customs, looted, brawled, and treated Moscow as occupied territory. The wedding itself, in May 1606, was conducted with a mixture of Catholic and Orthodox rites that scandalized the devout Russian population. Beneath the surface of public celebration and reform, resentment simmered. The boyars, many of whom had initially welcomed Dmitry to depose Godunov, quickly grew tired of his independent spirit and his perceived arrogance. They despised his disregard for traditional Muscovite customs and his favoritism towards his Polish entourage. The Orthodox Church was horrified by his religious laxity and Catholic wife. The common people, whose initial adoration had been fervent, began to feel betrayed as their expectations of immediate relief from all burdens went unfulfilled, and the Polish insolence grew intolerable. Whispers of his true identity, that he was not the Tsarevich Dmitry, but a runaway monk or a Polish impostor named Grishka Otrepyev, began to circulate once more, amplified by those with vested interests in his downfall. Leading the charge was Prince Vasily Shuisky, a cunning and ambitious boyar who had been a prominent figure under Boris Godunov and had initially sworn fealty to Dmitry. Shuisky had actually been the head of the commission investigating the Uglik death of the real Dmitry back in 1591, and he knew the truth of the Tsarevich death firsthand. He saw Dmitry's increasing unpopularity as his opportunity. Shuisky orchestrated a masterful conspiracy, fanning the flames of xenophobia and religious fanaticism amongst the Moscow populace. He spread rumors that Dmitry was planning to forcibly convert Russia to Catholicism and to hand over Muscovite lands to the Poles. On the night of May 17, 1606, just 2 weeks after Dmitry's marriage, Shuisky's plot erupted into a bloody uprising. Church bells rang out, not for celebration, but for alarm, signaling a supposed Polish plot to murder the Tsar and the boyars. A furious mob, incited by Shuisky's agents, stormed the Kremlin. The Polish retinues, caught largely unawares and vastly outnumbered, were massacred in the streets. False Dmitry I, attempting to escape from a window of the Kremlin palace, broke his leg and was apprehended. Dragged before the enraged crowd, he was subjected to a brutal interrogation, confirming his true identity as Grishka Otrepyev under duress. Then, with a savage brutality characteristic of the era, he was murdered. His body was mutilated, put on public display in Red Square for 2 days, and then, after the mob deemed him not sufficiently dead, he was cremated.
His ashes, mixed with gunpowder, were reportedly loaded into a cannon and fired in the direction of Poland, a symbolic expulsion of the impostor. With Dmitry I dead, the throne was once again vacant, plunging Russia deeper into chaos. Prince Vasily Shuisky wasted no time. In a hastily convened assembly of his loyal boyars and hand-picked supporters, rather than a genuine Zemsky sober, he was elected Tsar. On May 19, 1606, Vasily IV Shuisky ascended to the throne, his legitimacy immediately questioned by virtually everyone outside his immediate faction. To distinguish himself from previous Tsars, and perhaps to gain some measure of public trust, Shuisky took an unprecedented oath, the Krestosolowana Yazbe. He swore to rule justly, to consult with the boyars, and not to punish anyone without trial. This promise, intended to reassure, was instead seen by many as a sign of weakness, an admission that his power was not divinely ordained and absolute like that of Rurikids. Shuisky's reign was a desperate struggle for survival from its very beginning. The concept of a false Tsar had been introduced, and now with Dmitry I violently dispatched, the idea that the true Dmitry might still be alive, or that he had been unjustly murdered by Shuisky, gained traction. Rumors abounded that Shuisky had buried a false corpse, and that Dmitry had once again miraculously escaped. This fertile ground of popular belief, combined with ongoing social discontent, sparked a new and even more dangerous wave of rebellion. In the summer of 1606, a new figure emerged from the tumultuous southern frontiers, Ivan Bolotnikov, a former serf and veteran of Polish and Ottoman captivity. Bolotnikov, presenting himself as Dmitry Ivanovich's great voyevode and avenger, ignited a massive social uprising. His army was a dangerous and diverse mix: runaway serfs, rebellious peasants, disgruntled Cossacks, and even elements of the lower gentry who felt disenfranchised by the Moscow boyars. Bolotnikov's rebellion was not merely a challenge to Shuisky, it carried the terrifying specter of a full-blown social revolution, promising liberation for the oppressed and vengeance against the boyars and the wealthy. Bolotnikov's forces swept north, gathering strength and momentum, defeating Shuisky's armies and besieging Moscow itself for several months in late 1606. The capital was once again under existential threat, not from a foreign pretender, but from its own enraged populace. The siege was brutal, marked by intense fighting and widespread starvation within the city walls. Shuisky's position seemed untenable, trapped between an igniting populace and hostile boyar class. However, cracks eventually appeared in Bolotnikov's diverse coalition. Some of the gentry who had joined him, fearful of the radical social demands of the peasants and serfs, began to defect back to Shuisky. With renewed vigor and the aid of these defectors, Shuisky managed to break the siege and decisively defeat Bolotnikov's army at Tula in October 1607. Bolotnikov was captured, blinded, and then drowned. But his rebellion had exposed the fundamental weakness of Shuisky's rule and the deep fissures within Russian society. Yet even as Bolotnikov was being suppressed, the spirit of Dmitry persisted. Scarcely had the echoes of one rebellion died down than a new one arose. In the summer of 1607, another pretender appeared on Russia's western frontier. This man, whose true identity, even more obscure than his predecessors, was dubbed False Dmitry II by history, or more tellingly, the Tushno thief by Muscovites. He was a crude, brutal, and less charismatic figure than False Dmitry I, but he learned from his predecessors' mistakes. Crucially, he gained the support of numerous Polish-Lithuanian adventurers and disgruntled Russian nobles and Cossacks who had been part of Bolotnikov's shattered army. In 1608, False Dmitry II established a fortified camp in the village of Tushno, just a few versts miles from Moscow. From this camp he established a parallel court, a capital in waiting, complete with its own patriarch, Philibet, a Romanov who had been captured and coerced, boyars, and military administration. Russia now had two tsars, two patriarchs, and two governments, simultaneously claiming legitimacy. Many towns and regions swore fealty to the Tushno Tsar, creating an unbearable duality, a political schizophrenia that tore the country apart. In a bizarre twist of fate, Marina Minschek, the widow of False Dmitry I, was brought to Tushno. After some initial reluctance, she recognized False Dmitry II as her miraculously saved husband, lending him a crucial, if farcical, claim to legitimacy. Shuisky, besieged in Moscow, and his authority increasingly challenged, was in a desperate plight. His attempts to dislodge the Tushno Tsar were repeatedly repelled. His forces were depleted, his treasury empty, and his boyars untrustworthy. Recognizing his inability to stabilize the situation alone, Shuisky made a fateful decision in 1609. He sought foreign intervention. He concluded the Treaty of Viborg with Sweden, Russia's traditional rival, offering territorial concessions, Korela Fortress, in exchange for military aid. A Swedish expeditionary corps, under the command of Jacob de la Gardie, arrived to assist Shuisky in battling False Dmitry II and his Polish supporters. This move was a calculated risk that backfired spectacularly. While the Swedish forces initially helped Shuisky gain some ground against the Tushno camp, it provided Sigismund III Vasa, King of Poland-Lithuania, the perfect casus belli for open, full-scale intervention. Sigismund III had long harbored ambitions for the Russian throne for himself or his son, and now with Russia allied with Sweden, his own archenemy, he could claim to be protecting Russia from a Swedish invasion. In September 1609, Sigismund III, at the head of a formidable Polish army, crossed into Russian territory and laid siege to the strategically vital fortress of Smolensk. The time of troubles had now entered its most perilous phase, the internal civil war fueled by pretenders and social unrest.
The Great Anarchy was not a hyperbolic label. It was a terrifyingly accurate descriptor of Russia's predicament. Sigismund III's siege of Smolensk, which began in September 1609, encapsulated the full horror of this new phase.
For nearly 2 years, the ancient fortress, a vital gateway to Moscow, withstood the full might of the Polish-Lithuanian army. Its valiant defense, led by the voivode Mikhail Shane, became a symbol of Russian resilience, but it also drained the boyar government of resources and attention, leaving other fronts vulnerable. Meanwhile, Tsar Vasily IV Shuisky's desperate alliance with Sweden proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. While Jacob de Lagardy's Swedish mercenary force initially brought some successes, their discipline was notoriously poor and their loyalties fickle. More critically, their presence alienated the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, providing Sigismund with his casus belli and drawing him deeper into Russia. Shuisky found himself in an impossible bind, fighting a resurgent false Dmitry II, who, despite his diminished legitimacy, still commanded a significant following and occupied Tushino just outside Moscow, while simultaneously facing the burgeoning threat from Poland and managing his unreliable Swedish allies. The pressure on Shuisky reached breaking point. His efforts to dislodge false Dmitry II proved largely ineffectual, and the presence of the Swedes was an increasingly bitter pill for many Russians, who despised their Lutheranism and their plundering. The climax came on July 4, 1610, at the Battle of Klushino. A small but highly professional Polish cavalry force under the command of the brilliant hetman Stanislav Żołkiewski utterly routed a combined Russian-Swedish army far superior in numbers. It was a tactical masterpiece for the Poles and a devastating blow to Shuisky's authority. De Lagardy's mercenaries, demoralized and unpaid, largely defected or abandoned the field, some even briefly serving the Poles before retreating north. News of the Klushino disaster tore through Moscow like a wildfire. The boyars, many of whom had never fully supported Shuisky, seized their opportunity. On July 17, 1610, with popular discontent simmering and the threat of a Polish advance on Moscow imminent, Tsar Vasily IV Shuisky was forcibly deposed. He was compelled to become a monk, the traditional, humiliating path for a dethroned Tsar, and then, shockingly, handed over to the Poles, who took him to Poland where he would die in captivity. His reign, born of regicide and maintained by desperate measures, ended in utter humiliation. With no Tsar on the throne, Russia entered its most perilous interregnum. A provisional government known to history as the Seven Boyars assumed power. This council, dominated by figures like Fyodor Mstislavsky, was composed of the highest-ranking aristocrats, but their authority was fragile, their legitimacy tenuous, and their primary concern was often their own survival and the preservation of their estates amidst the escalating chaos. Faced with the immediate threat of Polish occupation and the lingering menace of various pretenders and bandit armies, the Seven Boyars made a fateful, arguably desperate decision. They invited the Polish king Sigismund III's son, Prince Władysław IV Vasa, to become the new Tsar of Russia. Their rationale was complex. By offering the throne to a foreign prince, they hoped to gain the military support of the Commonwealth, quell the internal disorders, and restore a semblance of order. Crucially, Władysław would have to convert to Orthodoxy and respect Russian traditions and laws, thereby safeguarding Russian sovereignty and the Orthodox faith. However, this was a highly controversial move, deeply divisive among the populace and even within the boyar class. For many, it represented a betrayal of national identity and religious conviction, an unthinkable capitulation to a Catholic power. Sigismund III, however, had his own ambitions. He harbored a strong desire for the Russian throne himself, not for his son. He also refused to allow Władysław to convert to Orthodoxy. This fundamental disagreement, coupled with Sigismund's continued siege of Smolensk and his growing presence in Russia, quickly soured the agreement. Despite this, the Seven Boyars, under pressure and fearing the complete collapse of order, opened the gates of Moscow to Polish troops. In September 1610, a Polish-Lithuanian garrison, commanded by hetman Żołkiewski, marched into Moscow and occupied the Kremlin, effectively transforming the Russian capital into a Polish protectorate. The ancient city, heart of Orthodox Russia, was now under the direct control of Catholic foreign occupiers. Prince Władysław, though proclaimed Tsar, never actually set foot in Moscow, let alone ruled. The occupation of Moscow and the perceived betrayal by the boyars ignited a fierce wave of national and religious resentment across Russia. This wasn't merely about who sat on the throne, it was about the very soul of Russia. The Orthodox Church, whose moral authority had remained relatively untouched throughout the Troubles, now emerged as a powerful rallying point against the Catholic Poles. Patriarch Hermogenes, a fervent opponent of the Polish occupation, issued impassioned appeals for national resistance, denouncing the boyars' actions and calling on the people to rise up and defend their faith and fatherland. His letters, smuggled out of the Kremlin, stirred the conscience of the nation. This appeal found fertile ground among the disparate elements of Russian society, the gentry, the townsmen, the peasants, and even some Cossacks, who, despite their earlier divisions, now found a common enemy in the foreign invaders. The first major attempt to liberate Moscow came in 1611, forming what is known as the First Zemsky Obolentie, or People's Militia. It was a formidable, if unwieldy force, primarily organized by Prokopy Lyapunov, a Ryazm Muzelman, with significant contributions from Ivan Zarutsky, a leader of the Tushino Cossacks, and Prince Dmitry Trebetsky. This militia marched on Moscow, besieging the Polish garrison in the Kremlin. However, the deep-seated social divisions that had plagued Russia throughout the Troubles quickly resurfaced. The gentry, led by Lyapunov, sought to restore traditional order and protect their landholdings, often clashing with the more radical anti-establishment Cossacks, who saw chaos as an opportunity for social upheaval and an end to serfdom. Tensions escalated, culminating in the murder of Lyapunov by disgruntled Cossacks in July 1611. With their leader gone and unity shattered, the First Oполenchie disintegrated, leaving the Polish garrison still entrenched in the Kremlin. The failure of this first popular uprising underscored the immense challenge of uniting a fractured nation, even in the face of foreign occupation. Adding to Russia's woes, Smolensk finally fell to the Poles in June 1611 after a heroic, nearly 2-year-long siege, further cementing Polish control over vast swaths of Russian Russia. Simultaneously, Swedish forces, still technically allied to Russia but acting opportunistically, seized Novgorod and other northern territories, establishing their own puppet state under a Swedish prince. Russia was being carved up, piece by agony piece. It was amidst this nadir of Russian sovereignty that the true spirit of national resilience finally coalesced. From the city of Nizhny Novgorod, a new, more unified movement began to emerge, driven not by ambitious boyars or disenfranchised gentry, but by the merchant class and Orthodox clergy. The impetus for this second Zemsky Oполenchie came from Kuzma Minin, a humble but respected meat trader and Posadsky Chelovek, townsman. In the autumn of 1611, Minin delivered a series of impassioned speeches in Nizhny Novgorod, urging the people to sacrifice everything for the liberation of Moscow and the restoration of Russian statehood. He called for a common fund, asking every citizen to donate 1/3 of their property, and if that wasn't enough, to sell their last possessions. If we wish to help the Moscow state, he declared, we shall not spare our property. We shall sell our houses and put our wives and children up for sale. This was not hyperbole. It was a desperate plea that resonated deeply. Minin, recognizing the need for military leadership, proposed that the command of this new militia be given to Prince Dmitry Pryatsky, a Rurikid nobleman and experienced military commander who had been wounded during the earlier fighting in Moscow. Pryatsky, despite his injuries, accepted the perilous task. What made this second Oполenchie different was its broad-based support, its disciplined organization, and its unwavering focus on a single shared goal, the expulsion of the Poles and the election of a legitimate Orthodox Tsar. It drew strength from towns and villages across northern and central Russia, carefully avoiding the divisive Cossack elements that had plagued the first militia. Throughout 1612, the second Oполenchie slowly but steadily gathered strength. Minin meticulously managed the finances and logistics, ensuring the troops were paid, fed, and equipped, a stark contrast to previous undisciplined forces. Pryatsky, meanwhile, proved to be an adept military strategist and a unifying figure, inspiring trust and loyalty. They established a provisional government, effectively creating a parallel state structure to the 7 boyars in Moscow, legitimizing their efforts to a populace yearning for stability. By August 1612, the unified forces of the Second Oполenchie, numbering in the tens of thousands, were approaching Moscow. They were joined by the remnants of the First Oполenchie, including Prince Trubetsky's Cossacks, who, chastised by their earlier failures, were now more amenable to unified command. The decisive battles for Moscow began in late August. Hetman Jan Karl Czotkaski, leading a Polish relief force, attempted to break through the Oполenchie's lines to resupply the starving garrison in the Kremlin. For several days, fierce fighting raged in and around the Novodevichi convent. Minin, demonstrating surprising military acumen, led a daring cavalry charge across the Moscow River, striking Czotkaski's flank and turning the tide of battle. The Polish relief force was decisively defeated and forced to retreat, leaving the Kremlin garrison utterly isolated. Starvation and disease now ravaged the Polish defenders within the Kremlin walls. The Oполenchie maintained a tight siege, refusing any quarter. Reports of cannibalism among the desperate Polish soldiers filtered out, highlighting the horrific conditions. Finally, on October 26, 1612, November 6, US, the Polish garrison, utterly depleted and without hope of relief, surrendered. The victorious Russian forces marched into the Kremlin, liberating the ancient seat of Russian power. The humiliation of foreign occupation was over. Moscow was free. With Moscow liberated, the immediate existential threat to the Russian state had been averted. However, the country remained deeply fractured, its economy shattered and its social fabric torn. There was still no Tsar, and the external threats from Poland and Sweden lingered. The task ahead was immense: to restore order, establish legitimate authority, and begin the painstaking process of rebuilding. To address this monumental challenge, a Zemsky Sobor, a national assembly of land, was convened in Moscow in January 1613. This was the broadest representative assembly in Russian history up to that point, bringing together delegates from boyars, gentry, clergy, townsmen, and even some free peasants. Their task was singular: to elect a new Tsar and restore the dynastic principle that had been shattered with the death of Feodor I. The process was fraught with political maneuvering and competing candidacies, including foreign princes. Władysław was still a possibility for some, various boyar families, and even Pryatsky himself. After weeks of deliberation and passionate debate, a consensus slowly emerged around a relatively unexpected candidate, Mikhail Fedorovich Romanov. Mikhail was a young 16-year-old boyar, known for his mild temperament, but more importantly, he was the son of Fyodor Ivanovich Denisenko, better known as Patriarch Filaret. Filaret, though then a captive in Poland, was a highly respected figure in the church, and a cousin of Anastasia Romanova, even the terror's first wife. This made Mikhail a distant relative of the extinct Rurikid dynasty, giving him a tenuous but acceptable claim by blood. Crucially, Mikhail was seen as a compromise candidate, young, untainted by the infighting and betrayals of the Troubles, and amenable to guidance. His election represented a desire for stability, an end to foreign interference, and a return to traditional Orthodox rule. On February 21, 1613, the Zemsky Sobor unanimously elected Mikhail Romanov as Tsar of all Russia. Messengers were dispatched to the Ipatiev monastery near Kostroma, where Mikhail and his mother were living, to inform him of his election. Initially, his mother was reluctant, fearing the dangers of the throne, but eventually Mikhail accepted. On July 11, 1613, Mikhail Romanov was crowned Tsar in the Dormition Cathedral in Moscow Kremlin, marking the official end of the time of troubles and the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia for over 3 centuries. However, the election of Mikhail Romanov did not instantly end Russia's travels. The country remained ravaged by famine, depopulation, and lawlessness. Cossack bands and remnants of various pretender armies continued to roam the countryside, engaging in plunder and brigandage. The wars with Sweden and Poland